I mean, there's several aspects to it. One of it is the geography. I discovered that when I went to Cape Town once. People get attached to particular iconic structures, and the Rock is a huge monolith of limestone, geological fault at the gateway of the Mediterranean, which has always created interest by Phoenicians, Romans, different peoples because of its position, its closeness to Africa. It was the end of the world, and I think when you live in a place like this, and it's particularly with a history of sieges, because you had a century of sieges in the 18th century, you create a complex structure of people, because Gib was one of the earliest multicultural societies, despite the Treaty of Utrecht sort of saying, that was 1713, saying that there couldn't be Jews and Africans here. The reality is that we've always had Arabs and Jews, and the community has had to survive against the Spanish claim over the sovereignty of the Rock. So people have tended to pool together and be very, certainly in terms of religion, very tolerant. And none of the groups, so if you identify people with Italian names, or Spanish names, apart from the predominance of a sort of patois, a Spanish patois, which is the average working language, really the overall cultures have disappeared. You don't get people who were Italian 2 generations ago still speaking Italian, as you might get in other countries. So there's a strong sense of Gibraltarian identity. And then, when you carve into that the colonial history, it's a complex history because it was hit by the class structure, and it was an adaptation of the British class structure. So what you had was the Brits at the top in the colonial period, which didn't end until the 1980s. And then you had the Gibraltarians in the middle, who were merchant class anyway, generally. And then you had working class people who were largely Spanish, or people who mixed with Spanish people. It's generalization, but it's roughly there. So by the time you get to the border closure in '69, you've got lots of things going on. You've got a lot of Spanish people rushing into Gibraltar who have connections with Gibraltar because they didn't want to be on the other side of the border. Many of them had already come over and established themselves in 1936 in reaction to the Civil War. And suddenly there was a sort of anti-culture thing with Spain, in the sense that people sort of tried to pretend that they almost didn't have the Spanish roots. And there was a sort of, people didn't talk about the fact that maybe they'd been born in Spain. There was that kind of thing, because it was Franco, it was a dictatorship, and people wanted to be on the British side of the equation. By the time you get to the 80s, 84, when the major employer, the dockyard, closes, you've got a real change, because the economics changed. The economy until 84 was 70+% MOD driven, Ministry of Defence driven. Suddenly that disappeared. Today, Ministry of Defence is about 6%. And that was quite a fast move to that figure. So over a 10-year period, it had really dropped hugely. And with that disappeared, all the people, if you go around Gibraltar, it's all military buildings. They're now ex-military buildings. So that community, which was lived in by overseas people for 3 years at a time, and then had Spaniards coming in to work, just changed completely. The strange thing about Gibraltarian culture today is that the new generation of Gibraltarians who were born or young when the border reopened in 1985, you'd expect to re-assimilate some of the Spanish culture. In fact, it's been the opposite. There's almost a difficulty in getting people to speak Spanish. They'll speak some patois at home or with their granny or their mum, but a lot of Gibraltarian families speak only English now. Why? I think the main reason for that is partly the closure of the border, but the continuity of a distance from Spain, because really we just didn't have much of a relationship with them. a failure by Spain to sort of, if you like, really open the border in an open arms sense, and of course an education system which developed in that period, which automatically sends our students to Britain, to university, with a scholarship if they get a place at a British university. So at the moment we're enjoying probably one of the best education systems in Europe in terms of opportunity. Graduates come back, they're trained in English, they speak in English, they intermarry in English, and so you really got a movement away. And then you've got the influence of media. You watch BBC, I mean, all the things that couldn't be done before are done now. The question of animosity of Spain is not in itself a passionate, nationalistic, anti-people thing. I say that because you know, well over 6 million Spaniards visit Gibraltar every year, and we don't have incidents with them. Gibraltarians spend their life going in and out of Spain, and they're very happy with that. A lot of Gibraltarians recognize that they have a strong Spanish culture, but as part of their general Mediterranean culture. So the issue is a political one, and I think people always hang on to the fact that the Spaniards themselves, for a very long time, certainly under Franco, but even since, lived under the pressure of a central government who dictated on certain aspects of life, and therefore the Andalusian who lives around Gibraltarians, generally speaking, is quite warm and open towards Gibraltarians. We don't feel hostility towards them. The hostility comes in a different form. It comes as a result of the simplest of mechanisms, which is the control of the border. Life is normal or not normal in Gibraltar, depending on the fluidity of that border. And the Spanish central government, for most of the time, has recognized that is its strongest pressure on the weakest point, which are the people themselves. And it uses that not just on Gibraltarian people, but on 6,000 Spaniards who legally come in to work every day in Gibraltar. I say legally because there are quite a few Spaniards, I think, who come in illegally, in the sense that they're probably claiming welfare on the Spanish side and maybe working as a nanny or a cleaner or whatever in Gibraltar. But in terms of people who've got full proper jobs, they're all affected and they don't like it. But the Spanish government has a sort of particular bee in its bonnet about the sovereignty, and it's 300 years on, and through history it's always failed to gain the sovereignty of Gibraltar. And you know, when things are difficult as they are at the moment in Spain, and when you've got a right-wing government, they put pressure. But you know, overall, actually, that's almost a theatre that goes on the side of what is actually, compared to a lot of places, actually quite an amicable relationship. Spaniards base a lot of what they do with the Spanish government on the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, which was a very sort of qualified, almost a lease-back handing over of Gibraltar in perpetuity, but with a first-back option clause. And that set out parameters like, they would argue that we don't have waters, that we don't have air. So from the Spanish point of view, and it's a strange one almost, but they see Gibraltar in almost a time bubble. It's 1713 in their mind in terms of the rights. So they don't look at any other rights applying to us, whether it's self-determination at the United Nations, whether it's access to Spain. They will never call the border or the frontier a border or a frontier. It's a gate. In Spanish they call it la verja, and they call it the gate. So around that, there are lots of complex little games that they play to put pressure on people to, I mean, basically, I think, to find themselves in the sad situation where, because we're already Europeans, because we have British nationality, because we can travel around the world and we have rights, they can't give us anything. You know, if we were Hong Kongese, maybe would have wanted British passports or whatever. You know, if we were Moroccan, we'd probably be all jumping over to say, well, you know, give us Spanish passports. But the reality is, they don't have much to offer us. So all they can do in response to that is try and deprive us of either free movement or just the right to enjoy life normally. And the incursions by Spanish fishing boats is really a sort of it's slightly devious on the side of the fishermen, because the fishermen at the end of the day are just working people who are having a hard time fishing. They're banned from fishing around most of Spain, around most of Morocco. And if they think they can get some positive relationship with the central government, which might end up in some kind of cash compensation, then they're quite happy to come into Gibraltar waters and try and fish. But you're talking about a handful of fishing boats, who are breaching the law. So there's no there's no great event going on there. I think one of the problems that we're suffering from at the moment, of course, is that because Gib is quite, is a fairly affluent society given the context of economies now. Lots of people have social media. Lots of people have cameras. Gib is famous historically because it's defensible and you can have views over the sea and the rest of it. So basically you see what's going on all the time and you hear it all the time. So it only takes one person to be looking out the window and you've got a constant flow of saying, oh, the Spanish boats come in, or this one's done that, which was happening 20 years ago, but no one was bothered about it. So we've become more sensitive to it. And I think underlying that is also that we now have a generation which is very educated, has political views of its own, but hasn't lived through the border closure and hasn't lived through the tougher times that Gib went through. So, in terms of sieges or mini sieges, it's only really the last closure of the border that was significant. In between that, we've had odd days when the borders become very difficult, and it's always just a signal from Madrid. Look, we're not being nasty to you. If we were really nasty, this is just a little flavor of what it could be like. The issue of decolonization of Gibraltar, in many respects, is actually a throwback to an era which has sort of got stuck, if you like, which is the decolonization process of the United Nations. And in a sense, it's complicated because you've still got a decolonization committee. Gibraltar's still listed amongst 16 territories, most of them British, as requiring decolonization. But the criteria which the territories themselves and the colonizing country, which is UK, apply are quite different to that of the UN. So what does that mean? That means that actually at the moment you've got the government and opposition in Gibraltar apparently arguing over whether Gibraltar should be decolonized or not. In fact, largely they agree on almost everything. It is just a different way of looking at it. The way in which the previous government looked at it, which was once they got the 2006 constitution, which was the second constitution for Gibraltar, no one even today really disagrees that that constitution gives us about as much autonomy as we can realistically have before we became independent. Add to that both parties are completely agreed that there is no volition for independence. Nobody really wants it. Why? Because we're part of the EU, it's through Britain and through the EU that we have fluidity at the border, that we have the life that we have. In other words, we have the rights that we have. So, if we were to declare UDI tomorrow, which no one is suggesting, the first thing that would probably happen is that the border would close and our economy would collapse, and very quickly would be running around saying, what club can we join? So in a world of where alliances and clubs, being part of people's clubs, is important, the actual issue of decolonization is much more about dealing with the Spanish issue. It's, at the moment, Gibraltar goes to the UN largely to counter Spain's claim that decolonization means the territory should be reintegrated into Spain. So it's that battle has defined itself as self-determination against territorial integrity, where territorial integrity means that Gibraltar would become part of Spain. And in that respect, I think the current government take the view that the fact that we might be as we want to be is not quite the same as being formally defined the way we want to be. And I suppose, you know, one is a legal marriage and the other one is just two people living together, and you can sort of look at it that way. And I'm not sure really that anyone expects that to go anywhere, but it's more that, you know, it's more of a neutralizing argument, which is going on all the time. When Spain comes into Gibraltar waters, it does so not as an invasion, but as an argument that it's patrolling its own waters. And that's why those issues become, you know, they're very academic and very old legal. But really, if you look at Gibraltar and you invert that, and I always think it's a bit like, you know, in Hamlet says he could be sort of king in a nutshell if he didn't have bad dreams. I mean, our bad dream is Spain. And we are stuck with it. But if you take that aside and take aside the fact that nor is Spain so evil that she's throwing bombs at us, the reality is that if Scotland had the political rights that we have, especially over taxation, it would be a revolution in Scotland. And it's, you know, I often say to Scottish people, actually what you want to do is become a colony, because you'd certainly have more rights than you have at the moment as a separate entity. It just doesn't sound very nice. So the question is, are we a colony or not? Well, when I used to write for the Times back in the 80s and 90s, it was a cliche into my stories. It was Time style to say the colony, and everybody used to moan at me then. When this political movement came up, when I stopped using the word colony in stories and saying the territory, everyone said, no, we're a colony, because of course if you're not a colony, you can't be decolonized. In terms of decolonization and the appearance of UK, non-appearance of UK formally, they do actually go to listen. In fairness, they take the position that they don't recognize the committee, and therefore they don't lend themselves formally to it. They will not sit, when they go to the sessions, in the designated seats for the UK. They sit as observers. And their statement is, we see that the committee exists, but we don't agree with it, and we won't participate in it, and therefore it's not needed. That is their position and that's why they don't go to the UN on the decolonization aspect. A lot of the time, you know, Britain always wanted Gib to get into negotiations of some form with Spain, because the UK's responsibility might be to us, but their underlying interest is a limited but real military interest. And outside that limited and real military interest, they basically say, well, but for the fact that you've got to deal with Spain, we would let you do what you want to. I mean, when the whole issue of joint sovereignty, which was a climax in recent history of different ways of trying to solve the issue, came up, the British position was that it wanted a solution between Gibraltar and Spain on Gibraltar generally, but a definition accepted by Spain of a sovereign base in Gibraltar. So despite the fact that Britain says, well, we don't really need the base, the fact is they keep it, and they don't keep it for charity, they keep it because they want it. And it might be not more useful tomorrow than it is today, but they want to hang on to it, and especially with US military interest in the submarine base. So I would say that, you know, that relationship is like any relationship. It's one where we have to understand that there are mutual interests and mutual responsibilities, which overall are good for us. I wouldn't lose track of the fact either that whilst everybody always talks about a solution, and for some the solution is that Spain drops it all and everything carries on as normal, that we become almost like as if we were independent. The truth of it is that managed, like a lot of problems in the world, if it's managed well, you shouldn't lose track that maybe the problem is actually part of why Gibraltar is a disproportionately overachieving mini nation. Actually, if no one had ever been bothered about anything in Gib, we might have ended up like one of the little villages the same size of us 50 miles away, where, you know, it's just farmland and that. Gib is quite sophisticated because it's got a base, because of its position, because of the problem with Spain, because of our access through UK into lots of organisations, whether it's the Commonwealth or, you know, we get small but real seats in the back of the family car. And I don't think we would get that, you know, if the problem weren't there. So to a degree, perversely, part of Gibraltar's success comes from the fact that it has an issue with Spain.